the tops of the finance industry as a whole. And on that basis, the economy as a whole can be planned under the control and management of the working class, who will directly participate in the planning of how the economy can move forward. Failing that, what future do you and your generation face? A future of wars, of massive bloodshed, of environmental destruction, and of a return to the standard of living that we thought had been eliminated in this country many, many decades ago. Those are the alternatives which history itself will present to you. Thank you.
Next speaker, Jim Dam.
Is there anyone going to speak on socialism like they have in Canada? I don't think you have a social...
Excuse me, sir. There's going to be comments and questions afterward, and we introduced the things earlier. I'm sorry, but we'll
we
get
don't
to
have
that
time
later.
for you, sir.
Jim, please go ahead and introduce yourself again.
Sure, my name is June. I'm actually an organizer for Campaign for Liberty. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I went to Berkeley, it's a very liberal environment. I voted for Clinton in 96, 2000. I supported Gore in 2004. I supported Kerry, right? But, I really wasn't into, ideology or philosophy back then. And it wasn't until the Ron Paul campaign in 2007 that I realized what made sense to me, right? So that's that's my story. So I'm an organizer for Campaign for Liberty, which is an offshoot of the Ron Paul campaign, and also an organizer for the End the Federal Reserve movement, the End the Fed movement. So I'd like to share, a little bit about that as well. So first thing I wanted to talk about is just definitions. I mean, what is capitalism? What is socialism? And I just wanted to define it so that you guys can see what, how I define it, right? Capitalism is an economic system whereby all property is privately owned. Does that make sense? Individuals own property. That's privately owned. Socialism is an economic system whereby much of the property is owned by the state, if not all. And then communism is, most often identified with abolition of all property. Right? So that's where I come from. Economic system, all privately owned or state-owned for socialism. So keep that in mind. So I wanted to talk to you about the concept of what is the government, what is the state, right? The government doesn't create anything, right? They administer, right? But the people are the ones that create things, right? Does that make sense? People, build homes, they grow food, they, build railroads and things like that. So people are the ones that create it. The government, when you think about it, they don't do any of that. The very existence of government is, having to actually exist through other people's labor, because how else is like a government official going to survive? They have to eat, right? They need a roof over their head, but they're not the ones that are creating it, right? They're not the ones growing. So the idea that the state does not create anything, and that's a very important point. What they do is, though, they redistribute wealth because they have the power to extract from those that create, and for whatever reason can reallocate it to someone else. Does that make sense? They don't create anything, but they do have the power to redistribute wealth. It's a very important concept, right? So does that make sense? So with that, I'll come with a ethical argument for capitalism, an ethical argument. Capitalism enables voluntary exchange where people create things and voluntarily exchange it between each other, right? Socialism actually requires stealing, because it is the government that takes from one group of people to give to the others for whatever, for the benefit of society or whatever it may be, but they have to take from one to give to the other. They don't create anything, so it's only a redistribution. So this is very important. So the ethical argument is that capitalism enables voluntary exchange, whereas socialism requires stealing. Okay, and Ayn Rand, who's she's an objectivist. Her whole philosophy is based on rational reason, and this is her definition of capitalism, or the moral justification of capitalism. She says the moral justification of capitalism does not lie in the altruist claim that it represents the best way to achieve the common good. It is true that capitalism does. So she's saying, in a practical sense, it actually does. But if the catchphrase has any meaning. But this is merely a secondary consequence. The moral justification of capitalism lies in the fact that it is the only system consonant with man's rational nature, that it protects man's survival qua man, and that is the ruling, and that its ruling principle is justice. And so, if everybody's equal, right? You, I, and everybody here, whether whatever condition we're in, we're equal, and that's what our founding fathers. That's the philosophy of our founding fathers. If you read into history, and this came out of the Enlightenment, right? And John Locke is the philosopher that talked about life, liberty, and property, and with this exact idea. So does that make sense? I mean, in the notion of that makes sense to everybody. So so then let's talk. Okay, that's the ethical argument. So the next argument is the practical argument, and I'd like to give an example of what happens in practice of kind of a socialist system. So let's say you have a class, right? And everybody takes the test. And this is an example I got through email. Now I think it's a great way of displaying the practical, I guess, consequences of socialism. So the teacher says, well, okay, everybody studied, but I want to kind of experiment on the socialist system. So no matter what grade you actually got in this test, I'm going to give everybody B's, right? Everyone's going to get B's, all right? So that's equal. Everyone's equal now, right? So, the next time, the people who studied hard, they got, higher grades. They realized, hey, I could study hard, but this is not going to get me anywhere. So the next time, everybody took a test, because of the system. They realized no matter how hard I work, I'm not going to get a better grade. And those that didn't work realized that other people were going to actually do the work, right, to study, and everyone got D's, right? Because no one really studied. And then, bickering ensued, people were blaming each other, and, and by the time the third test rolled around, everyone got X. So it gives you the notion of what happens in a kind of socialist system where there's no incentive, right? And this is, okay, now, this is just a concept, and I hope you guys understand this concept. But history kind of reveals that this is true. This is what happens. The Pilgrims, the Puritan separatists in 1620, when they came to America, right? They, they had a colony, and they had a system where nobody owned property, right? Nobody owned property, and there was no division of labor. And so what happened was, they realized people were starving. People were, everyone who grew corn had to put it in, and it was equally distributed among everybody else, right? Yeah. So, but what happened was, at least in this case, so they distributed everyone. The wives had to kind of dress the meat for everybody else. And what happened was, well, they started starving, and things just didn't work out, and people were trying to figure out why. But because there was no incentive. So what they did was they gave everybody a little plot of land, and they said, okay, to each family their own. They can create their own, and the wives can just prepare the meat for their husbands, and it actually worked. And this was from 1620 to 1647. I mean, they started with kind of more of a commune type system from 1620 to 1623, but that's when the famine started. And then from after that, where they changed it.